Good evening and welcome. We're so glad you're all here this evening. Hang on one second. Okay. All right. Sorry about the little delay. I welcome everybody. Good evening and welcome to the Lux Center for Catholic Jewish Studies Winter Webinar Series, Jewish Studies Seminar for Christians, the Jewish People and the Church. My name is Bonnie Shafran, and I'm the director of the Lux Center for Catholic Jewish Studies at Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology, and I will serve as the moderator for this program this evening. To learn more about the Lux Center and upcoming events, or to lend your financial support to ensure that these programs continue, please visit the Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology website at www.shsst.edu and click on the Lux Center at the top of the homepage. I want to express my sincere thanks to Brittany Hager McNeely for lending her time, her skills, her technological expertise to ensure that this webinar works seamlessly. I thank Father Raul Gomez, President Rector of Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology, for his constant encouragement and support, the priests of the Sacred Heart who support the Lux Center in so many ways, and to the Harry Hoffman Family Foundation for granting us the funds to enable this program to be presented to you. We are pleased to be able to present to you the Jewish Studies Seminar series that addresses the answers to questions that as Christians you may have thought about but were too afraid to ask. We hope that you will ask questions, and in order to ask a question, you will find at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. And if you click on the Q&A, you can type in your question at any time during the presentation. After our speaker is finished with her presentation, there will be time for me to choose some of your questions for our speaker to answer. The topic for tonight's session is Christianity and the Holocaust, Action and Reaction in Challenging Times. We are pleased and honored to welcome our scholar presenter for this evening, Dr. Rebecca Carter-Chand. Dr. Carter-Chand is the director of the programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I will remind you to type in your questions that you might have at any time during this session. The questions will be answered after our speaker finishes her presentation. Remembering the Holocaust and the events that led up to it is a duty that is incumbent upon all of humanity. And on March 12, 1998, the Vatican described the Holocaust as follows, and I quote, "This century has witnessed an unspeakable tragedy which can never be forgotten. The attempt by the Nazi regime to exterminate the Jewish people with the consequent killing of millions of Jews, women and men, old and young, children and infants, for the sole reason of their Jewish origin, were persecuted and deported. Some were killed immediately, while others were degraded, ill-treated, tortured, and utterly robbed of their human dignity. And then they were murdered. Very few of those who entered the concentration camps survived, and those who did remained scarred for life. This was the Shoah, and Shoah is the Hebrew word for Holocaust. We will begin the session with a short video to remember the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis and their collaborators during the Holocaust, and the approximately 5 million non-Jews who they targeted and killed on racial or political grounds. On this video, you will see images from the Auschwitz concentration camp and hear the singing of a prayer that is sung at many Holocaust memorial services. The prayer says, "I believe with perfect and complete faith in the coming of the Messiah, and even though he may tarry, I will wait for him whenever he comes." Some of you might remember this statement from Rabbi Scott Shaffrin's presentation on January 27th. It is the 12th of the 13 principles of faith that were written by Jewish philosopher and theologian Moses Maimonides during the Middle Ages.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. My name is Rebecca Carter Chand, coming to you from my home in Arlington, Virginia, where I'm very happy and honored to speak to you this evening. Let me just get myself set up with my screen sharing. But before I do that, I'll just say I'm so glad that you showed that video at the beginning. I know the series that tonight is part of is the Jewish people and the church. And tonight I'll actually be talking a lot about Christians, not about Jews, but about the actions of Christians during the Holocaust and leading up to the Holocaust, which of course had such a profound impact on the faiths of Jews and other persecuted peoples across Europe during the years of the Holocaust. So one moment. All right. So I hopefully that is showing my screen properly, and Bonnie, you will speak up if there's a problem. Okay. So I want to start tonight in actually an unexpected place, not on the railroad tracks to Auschwitz or some of those iconic images that we just saw in that video, but actually in the United States in 1936 with an American Seventh-Day Adventist woman. So in March 1936, the American Seventh-Day Adventist, Louise Cloizer, found herself in a professional and moral predicament. I have a photo here of Louise Cloizer. So Louise was tasked with accompanying a German Adventist representative named Hulda Jost on her 3-month North American speaking tour. Serving as Jost's interpreter, Louise Cloizer traveled with Hulda Jost to more than 140 public lectures for church congregations, college campuses, women's clubs, and German societies all across North America. And so as the head of the German Adventist Welfare Organization, Hulda Jost spoke about progressive German social welfare practices and how helping the poor and needy was the essence of Christianity. But what became increasingly apparent to Louise Cloizer was that Hulda Jost's talks often veered away from the devotional sorts of talks that she was supposed to be giving into more political grounds, where she was praising Adolf Hitler, his efforts toward peace, so-called, and his reconstruction of the German economy, at the same time dismissing reports about the mistreatment of Jews in Germany and the suppression of the German churches. And so as a German-American woman born in Barmen, Germany in 1890, and having immigrated to the United States as a child, Louise Cloizer was deeply concerned about Hulda Jost's political messages. And she wrote several letters to the Seventh-day Adventist leadership while she was on the road, serving as this interpreter. After the Oregon Journal reported on a Portland event with the headline, "German Church Emissary Denies Hitler a Jew Hater," Louise wrote a very candid letter and attached this newspaper article and sent it to the head of the Seventh-day movement. You see another newspaper article here from the Detroit Free Press, and yet another one, "Meeting Hears, Hitler Praised." Fraulein Jost speaks at Battle Creek. So when Louise Cloizer wrote this letter expressing her concern, she wrote the following: "This newspaper article clearly reveals that her," meaning her, Hulda Jost, "her main burden for her visit was to clear Germany's record. No wonder German consuls welcome this. I can't help wondering where we as a church might be if in the near future Germany decides to turn on Hitler. Our sister is positively playing with fire. Getting a perspective of Sister Jost's whole propaganda, I feel she may bring us in the future far more embarrassment than we can trust our brethren right up close to the problem in Europe to see now. And so these letters, which I found in the Seventh-Day Adventist archive just outside of Washington, D.C., these letters really reveal Louise Cloyser wrestling between her professional duty as an interpreter and the spiritual bonds she felt toward a fellow Adventist, and her grave concerns that the American Adventist Church was being drawn into the political agenda of Nazi Germany. But despite her warnings, Hulda Jost's tour continued as planned. Now, this propaganda tour, I won't go into too much detail about it, but just to give you a bit of context, it does fit into a wider pattern of the smaller Christian churches in Germany that were subtly mobilized by the German government in the 1930s to promote Germany abroad and to assuage any potential doubts about religious freedom under National Socialism. And so the story of how the Nazi regime came to use these religious communities as really soft propaganda tools is a fascinating one that explains a lot about Nazi pragmatism. But this interplay that I find so fascinating between Hulda Jost and Louise Cloyser and the respective communities that they represented also highlights some of the challenges faced by fellow Christians and the churches, especially those that had ties to fellow Christians in different countries. How to relate to fellow Christians when one has embraced a political regime at home that is really built on exclusionary ethno-nationalism, anti-Semitism, and violence. And I start with this story, knowing that I'm speaking to a Catholic seminary tonight. And so I wanted to start purposely with not a Catholic story to highlight, another one of the churches in Germany. But, this story also really highlights the individual actions and reactions made by Christians who were not necessarily clergy and who were not in high positions of power. So women and Protestants, Catholics, people who belonged to the smaller minority churches in Germany. And so for my talk tonight, I want to focus on Germany in the 1930s and mostly before the war, so before 1939, when really crucial decisions were made around the time when Hitler first came to power. There's lots more to say about the war years, when Germany's reach extended far across Europe and resulted in the deportation and murder of millions of Jews. But tonight, in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on really the beginning of the story. So, Christianity has this concept of sins of omission. Oh, sorry, I forgot one slide, which is just a plug for one of our wonderful resources at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and that is a tool called Experiencing History. And so if any of you watching tonight's webinar are either teaching others or if you're just interested in this history yourself, you can go to this tool called Experiencing History that the museum has produced, which has sort of curated primary sources. And so there's one collection of these primary sources on American Christianity and the Holocaust, which I and a colleague put together. And you can actually see this letter, because I chose to include this letter from Louise Cloyser that she wrote to her leadership. And you can see, it's scanned and you can read the original, handwritten letter. So, back to sins of omission and sins of commission. All too often in the discussions about the Christian churches and the Holocaust, there is this emphasis on silence or what the church failed to do. There's a whole field of study about the supposed silence of Pope Pius XII. And on the Protestant side as well, we can look to some of the earliest statements that were made after the war. Most famously, the Stuttgart Declaration of Guilt, which I also want to show you right here. And this only shows a small part of the Stuttgart Declaration, which was written in 1945 and in October 1945. Really to respond to make a statement to other Protestants abroad. And it says the part that I have here in bold, which I want to draw your attention to. They say, we accuse ourselves for not standing to our beliefs more courageously, for not praying more faithfully, for not believing more joyously, and for not loving more ardently. So, what I want to do today by signaling, to action and reaction is to get away from this idea of putting the church in this passive position and asking what they didn't do, to flip that around and, and to ask what people did do. There's been a lot of research published over the past 30 years about the churches in Nazi Germany, particularly, and increasingly more and more on the churches in other European countries as well, affected by the Holocaust. And increasingly, this scholarship really asks what people did do: clergy, laity, leadership, local parishes. So we're really trying to move beyond this concept of bystander, which has a very sort of passive connotation. It makes it sound like they were just on the sidelines watching what was happening. And so I first want to step back and talk about the religious landscape of Germany. I'm not sure how many people watching tonight have that background. And then we'll look at how the German churches responded to the rise of Nazism, looking at this idea of action and reaction. So the German churches were really the pillars of German society and played an important role in shaping people's attitudes and actions. And as you can see from this pie chart, the vast majority of Germans belonged to a Christian church. Around 2/3 of Germany was Protestant, around 1/3 was Catholic, just under 1% was Jewish. A lot of people are surprised by that, how low that number is. And less than 1% belonged to other Christian traditions. So in Germany, a person was born into a religious confession, and the vast majority of people were born into either the Protestant or the Catholic Church, which meant they were baptized, confirmed, they received either Protestant or Roman Catholic religious instruction in school, and they paid church taxes. The Protestant Church was made up of both a Lutheran and Reformed tradition. And this was a confederation of state churches, which had a longstanding close ties to the state. The Catholic Church had a stronger presence in the south and in the western parts of Germany. And it had sort of the recent history of having been suppressed during the Kulturkampf, which was a conflict between the German government and the Roman Catholic Church in the mid to late 19th century. And so they had their own political party, the Catholic Center Party, which a lot of Catholics voted for. Now, you'll see one of these tiny parts of the pie chart belongs to the other Christian churches, very small in number, but there were these free churches. Now, those were those churches that did not want to join the United Church efforts in the 19th century, and so they didn't collect church taxes themselves, but they were recognized by the state. So we have Lutheran and Reformed free churches, also Mennonites, Moravian Brethren, and Jewish synagogues also had the status of being recognized by the state. But in the second half of the 19th century, many more Christian groups and denominations came to Germany. many of them from Great Britain or North America. And yeah, you can see some of those groups on the list on the slide. And after World War I, the new Weimar Constitution, so from the year 1919, stated that there was no state church in Germany. And this was really meant to protect the religious liberties of individuals, churches, and religious communities. But the two main churches, the main Protestant church and the Catholic church, were still very closely tied to the state, and they received subsidies in addition to church taxes. And so, the question is, how did the German churches respond to the rise of Nazism? And the brief answer is that most Christians welcomed the rise of Nazism in 1933. But, and this is a very important but, they were shaped by more than just their religious beliefs. So when we look at, Christians, we're, as you can see from the pie chart, we're also looking at Germany. Over 97% of Germans were Christian in one form or another. And so their ideas were shaped by many different factors. Of course, nationalism was very important at that time. There was a huge backlash against the Weimar Republic, which is really an experiment in democracy formed after Germany lost World War I. There was a lot of resentments in Germany around that. Many Protestant leaders, especially, were very conservative and skeptical of parliamentary democracy. There was also anti-communism, which played a large role in shaping people's attitudes. Hitler was seen as a bulwark against communism. We can also look to the traditional loyalty to governing authorities that we can observe, especially in Protestants. And then on the Catholic side, and also some of these smaller churches, the free churches and the other smaller minority churches, there was sort of an extra effort to prove their loyalty to the state. And so all of these different political, social, historical factors converged with Nazi anti-Semitism, of course, which overlapped with a widespread and deep-seated anti-Jewish prejudice in the Christian tradition. And so I want to spend a bit more time here and quickly trace the continuities of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism and how the Nazis really capitalized on it. Some of this might be familiar to some people in the audience tonight. So Nazi anti-Jewish ideology is not synonymous with Christian anti-Judaism. Of course, we know this. The Nazis took it much further and really had a racial conception of their anti-Semitism. But historically, we can look back and see these threads throughout European Christianity. And historically, this prejudice really emerged out of the early church after its break with Judaism. And after Christianity became established in the 4th century, anti-Jewish laws were passed in Europe. And there was a lot of animosity that was driven by the failure of conversion efforts. And really, the church began to look on the Jews as a special group of people, different from Christians, who were perhaps deaf to Christianity and dangerous to the Christian faith. And so I have a couple of familiar images here of ecclesia and synagoga, which personify church and synagogue, very common in medieval art. You see statues and the stained glass windows here, with synagoga blindfolded or is always looking down and often blindfolded, reflecting that supersessionism. We can also, when we're just tracing, and I know I'm moving very quickly along here, but also very important are the blood libels, which persisted in the medieval period, and in some cases right up to the 19th and even the 20th century. But this rumor that accuses Jews of kidnapping and murdering Christian children in order to use their blood for religious rituals, these types of ideas and imageries were, I would say, greatly ingrained in the idea and the culture of Christianity in Europe. If we turn to the Protestant side and the legacy of Martin Luther, this is very important in Germany. Of course, we have this piece by Luther from 1543 on the Jews and their lies, which really calls for setting fire to synagogues and schools and unleashing violence against Jews. And Martin Luther's anti-Semitism has a direct connection to Nazi Germany because the Nazis really saw Luther as a national hero as well as a Protestant hero. The Nazis really emphasized their connection with Martin Luther. And you see here a photo of Luther Day, a Luther anniversary being celebrated in 1933. Now, if we go, fast forward through the 19th century, sort of the changing conceptions of from a theological anti-Judaism into more of a political and even racial anti-Semitism, we come all the way up to how the Nazis were looking back on these different waves and ideas of anti-Judaism. And you see them relying on these, ingrained ideas to great effect. I have here a couple images from Der Stürmer, which was not the official newspaper, but very widely read in Nazi Germany as sensationalist and extremely anti-Semitic. Its publisher, Julius Streicher, was actually executed for crimes against humanity in 1946. And so we can see this connection between the long history of anti-Semitism and the Nazi, particular form of Nazi anti-Semitism, because the Nazis really used these Christian symbols and religious traditions in their own anti-Semitism, precisely because they knew it would resonate with people. Here is an issue from Easter 1933, and it says, the Jews nailed Christ onto the cross and thought he was dead. He is risen. They nailed Germany to the cross and thought it was dead, and it is risen more gloriously than before. Here's another one a little bit later from 1938, but also from Holy Week. So you see, each year around the time of Easter, that these, religious imagery related to anti-Semitism was used. And again, we see this Christian imagery being used. Now that's on the Nazi side. Back to what Christians were thinking. What were the Nazis? What was the Nazis' position toward Christianity? And a lot of people, for a lot of Christians in Germany, they look back to the 1920 Nazi Party platform, which is the first time the new Nazi movement really articulated their values and ideas. So this was written when the Nazi movement was still very young. There were 25 points in total. This article number 24 was very important because it spoke about this idea of positive Christianity. The party upholds the point of view of a positive Christianity without tying itself confessionally to any one confession. It combats the Jewish materialist spirit at home and abroad, and is convinced that a permanent recovery of our people can only be achieved from within on the basis of the common good before the individual good. And so this idea of positive Christianity was, left vague, but it did give the sense that there was room for Christians in the Nazi Party and in Nazi society. And most Germans would have read this as an affirmation of Christianity. And of course, claiming to not give a preference to one particular confession or the other was in keeping with the Weimar Constitution. And so when Hitler first came to power in January 1933, there was enthusiasm among the majority of Germans. And indeed, Hitler's first radio address after coming to power, he said, "The national government will maintain and defend the foundations on which the power of our nation rests. It will offer strong protection to Christianity on the basis of our collective morality." So Hitler and the Nazi Party are in power January 1933. And if you know about the history of the period, things change very quickly. And the first couple of years is quite, I think, disorienting. And a lot of things change in German society. I want to speak first a few minutes about the Protestant Church, and then I'll say something about the Catholic Church. Many of you have probably heard of the Protestant church struggle, which is really the ongoing debate and struggle for control over the Protestant Church between the German Christians and the confessing church. The important thing to remember is that there were a whole lot of people in the middle who were neither affiliated with neither side, but who were just trying to remain neutral or to not get involved in this. But the German Christians within the Protestant Church were the group that were really trying to fuse Christianity and National Socialism. And so they had a vision for what they called a racially pure church, and they began to attack Jewish influences on Christianity. So they harassed converts from Judaism to Christianity and tried to bar them from being in the pulpit, even though they were, actual cases of converts from Judaism were very small in Germany at the time. The German Christians also rejected the canonicity of the Old Testament. They denied the Jewish ancestry of Jesus, and they even tried to remove words like Hosanna and Hallelujah. Have here another photo from another book by that Julius Streicher, who published that newspaper I showed you a moment ago. This is from a children's book called The Poison Mushroom, and it really captures this idea. It has these people with stereotypical Jewish features coming out of a church, and it says baptism didn't make them into non-Jews, which encapsulates their views on race and religion, that baptism didn't make a Jew into a German, nor did it make a Christian. So the German Christian movement had support from the Nazi Party in the early years. When the Nazis came to power, the German Christians occupied key posts in the church all across the country. And at the height of its popularity, approximately 1/3 of Protestant clergy joined. We don't have accurate numbers for how lay people polling opinion polls for lay people at the time. This image just shows the church elections in 1933, the installation of Reich Bishop Müller, who was a German Christian. Some clergy, including Martin Niemöller, were very much against the efforts of the German Christians and formed a pastors' emergency league, which then evolved into the Confessing Church the next year in 1934, which was really a coalition of pastors and higher clergy and lay people. And its founding statement was the Barmen Declaration. So this was largely the ideas of Karl Barth, and it strongly condemned Nazified theology as a false doctrine and of Nazi efforts to incorporate church activities with Nazi life. So the main issue at stake with the confessing church was the all-encompassing nature of Nazism. But the confessing church really limited its protests to maintaining the autonomy and theological integrity of the Protestant churches, not protesting the legitimacy of the Nazi state itself. So it would be a mischaracterization to call the confessing church a resistance movement against Nazism. In the past, it's been called a loyal opposition, and there's been some important work that has been done to show that many, even in the confessing church, many people were certainly very nationalistic, and some of them were also quite anti-Semitic, which I think again points to the pervasiveness of anti-Semitism within Christianity at this time. I think I have more time, so a bit more time, but please interrupt me when we need to move to the audience questions. This whole sort of debate and struggle that I've just been describing was really at its height in the first few years of the Nazi movement, which I think is important that we sort of stop and wrestle with this struggle before, far before we get into the actual years of the Holocaust and look to, when these key decisions were being made and when perhaps history could have taken a different course. It is important to note that the churches did remain independent in Nazi Germany, unlike many other parts of German civil society. And after a few years, the German Christian movement, for many different reasons, kind of lost momentum, but the German Christians themselves didn't disappear, and they remained in their posts as pastors and professors in theological faculties throughout the Nazi period, and in some cases even beyond World War II into the post-war period. Now, I know I've said a lot about Protestants so far, but let me say a bit about the Catholic Church as well. This map here shows the November 1932 federal elections. So this is the last election before Hitler was appointed chancellor in 1933. You see, this is the election where 33% of the population voted for the Nazi party, the NSDAP. And this map shows parties with the largest share of votes in these different areas of Germany. And you see that in the more Catholic areas which are Black, they voted for the Catholic Center Party, which I mentioned before, rather than the Nazi Party. So we can really see that in terms of voting for the Nazis in those last free elections, the Protestants voted for the Nazi Party in much greater numbers than Catholics did. Hitler, of course, was a baptized Catholic from Austria, and he remained in the Roman Catholic Church for his entire life. But German Catholicism was a bit of a different situation from the Protestant Church because German Catholicism came into conflict with the Nazi movement a bit more from the beginning, sort of similar to the confessing church. Anti-Semitism was not the main source of the conflict, though. German Catholic bishops spoke out in the 1920s against Hitler's glorification of race and blood, but they rarely said anything very specific about the Nazis' anti-Semitic propaganda or the physical violence against Jews. And so after Hitler became chancellor, the Catholic Church hierarchy was in a sort of tricky situation, having been opposed to National Socialism, but it too had a long history of respecting governmental authority. And of course, the church institutions were concerned with protecting the religious liberties of Catholics. And so very quickly, Hitler made efforts to appease Catholics, promising to keep agreements, promising to keep confessional religious education in the schools. And so Catholic bishops lifted the ban on National Socialism, but they didn't, at the same time, they didn't exactly encourage anyone to join the party. But previous bans were lifted. So, for example, administering the sacraments to people in Nazi uniforms, or allowing Nazis in uniforms to attend services, displaying Nazi flags, etc. No one wanted another Kulturkampf, and they all wanted to get along with the new government. A Reichskonkordat, or a treaty negotiation, was signed between the Holy See and the German Reich in July 1933, and this guaranteed the rights of Catholics in Germany. And now, I just, of course, say just a word about the Vatican, because this has become such an important and fascinating topic, really a renewed interest in this field because of the opening of the Vatican Archives for the period of Pope Pius XII, which opened this past March, or March 2020, just as COVID was really gaining steam, which has put a wrinkle in the plans of a lot of my colleagues who are Catholic historians. But I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A, and how the Holocaust Museum is involved in some of these efforts to look at these records, millions and millions of pages. I think it's 16 million pages that has been previously not available to researchers. And so hopefully we will know a lot more about the role of the Vatican at the very top, and Pope Pius XII. I know I have just a few minutes remaining, and so I want to go back to those free churches and the smaller churches. I began with the story about the Seventh-Day Adventists, which I think a lot of people maybe are not aware that there were these smaller churches in Germany. This happens to be my own area of research. I've written about the Salvation Army and the Quakers and the Adventists. And so, looking at the religious minorities of a country, I think is especially illuminating. And when the Nazis came to power, it was not exactly clear at the beginning what would happen to these religious minorities in Germany. All of them tried to demonstrate their loyalty to Germany and to the new government, some with more success than others. Of course, we know that Jehovah's Witnesses were banned by the Nazis, really because they refused to, because of their pacifist beliefs, they refused to participate in the military, but they also refused to give these public demonstrations of loyalty to the state. So saying the Heil Hitler, saying Heil Hitler, giving the salute, displaying the flag, participating in Nazi organizations, etc. The government also tried to ban the Seventh-Day Adventists in 1933, but the ban was lifted after just a couple of weeks after the leadership petitioned the government and convinced them that they supported this positive Christianity, that phrase from the 1920 party platform that I showed you a few minutes ago. A lot of the other smaller churches, the Salvation Army, the Baptists, the Methodists, were not banned by the Nazis, and actually got along more or less intact throughout the 30s and 40s. Now, just by way of conclusion, when we talk about Christianity and the Holocaust, there are so many different topics that I could have really dove into in detail. I chose today to look at the early years of the Nazi regime and the actions and reactions of the German churches, Protestant, Catholic, and minority churches. But we could have looked at beyond Germany as well. This is an area that is increasingly drawing the attention of historians who work on other countries, whether it's Western Europe or Eastern Europe, neutral countries, Switzerland, Sweden, occupied countries. the dynamics are so dependent on the political situation and the timing of the war. But the question of how various church institutions and religious networks and individual people chose to act and react to what was going on around them is, I think, incredibly important for anyone of faith, regardless of your own particular religious tradition. So perhaps there I will just stop, because I am interested in hearing people's questions and comments, and I'll give it back to Bonnie.
Thank you, Dr. Carter-Chan. That was very interesting. I'm sure people learned things that they didn't know before, and there are many questions. But before I go to the questions that we have on here, you mentioned about talking about the Vatican Archives. And people might not know that the archives from the period of Pope Pius XII were sealed until recently. Could you talk a little bit about why were they sealed? Why are they open? And maybe some of, are there specific topics that that your fellow scholars are anxious to get in there to find out about and research?
Sure, that's a great question. And I can answer this, not as a Catholic historian myself, but we at the museum, we are very involved in these efforts. So I think the records from the pontificate of Pius XII has been a contentious issue for decades, and particularly I think for the Jewish community and scholars of the Holocaust, this has been incredibly important. But up until now, their efforts have not been successful, and so I think it was a bit of a surprise when they announced, it was a full year ahead that they announced that the Vatican announced that they would be opening the archives for this period, and which was met with, great excitement and anticipation, I think, for scholars. But I think what people are trying to communicate is that, we can't just go in there and find a magic bullet. These records are spread over, I believe, 6 or 7 different archives in Vatican City, millions and millions of pages. And so researchers will be taking years and years to go through everything. Some of the things that my colleagues are particularly interested in is not just the writings, the correspondence, and trying to figure out more information about Pope Pius XII himself, but really more about the church hierarchy, people lower down in the hierarchy, the situation in many different countries, Catholic that had Catholic populations. So, the correspondence, people who specialize in Romania, say, or Poland, going in and trying to learn more about the situations in those countries. So it's no longer just focused on Pius XII. I think people will be interested in learning more about various religious orders and about nuns and different women religious. And so we're really, can learn so much from these archives that I think we've been talking a lot about how to move beyond the pious wars of the past, where it all just boils down to, was he a good guy or not? So.
Okay, thank you. So one of the questions is, during World War II, how did the Germans rationalize torturing, executing Jews, and attend church services to worship a Jew named Jesus Christ? That's a little light question.
I mean, yeah, on one level, how can you answer that? Yes, it is mind-boggling, I think, for any of us. So the German Christians, as I said, would have denied the Jewishness of Jesus, and they did that. Now, did every soldier or SS guard who was involved in some way in perpetrating the Holocaust sort of be aware of and bought into those ideas that the German Christians? I don't know that the German Christians necessarily had that broad of a reach. So yes, I mean, it's hard as a historian to get inside the mind of people except through the sources that we have. I'll say that. And so what we can do is read often between the lines of people's actions, but certainly Germans who were, present and participating actively in the persecution and killing of Jews, did, still practice their Christian faith and certainly kept their Christian identity throughout. So.
Okay, so you mentioned the Concordant of the Vatican with Germany, and there's a question about that. Did the Concordant effectively silence most Catholic protests against the Nazis?
That's an interesting question. It was meant to protect the rights of Catholics in Germany, and just about as soon as it was signed, I think the Nazis started to break those agreements in it. So they certainly didn't, keep their side of the bargain. I think there still was room for protest, and there's one, famous example that I really think is an important one, which is of a Catholic bishop, von Galen, from Münster, who chose in the summer of 1941 to give a series of sermons very publicly criticizing the Nazi regime. And these sermons were also written, reproduced, and circulated quite widely in Germany. So it was, far beyond just his own church. And one of these sermons in particular really criticized the Nazis' euthanasia program, so the killing of people with disabilities. And, these sermons have been translated and published. You can read them. And so you can kind of analyze his arguments, and he's been criticized because he did not say anything about the Jews, or the Nazi persecution of the Jews in this. So he certainly cannot be just sort of put up on a pedestal. But what is interesting, perhaps because of his important position of power, but he suffered somewhat for choosing to speak out and protest in this way. But he wasn't, he was under house arrest, but he wasn't punished that severely. He actually survived the war and was promoted after the war. He became a cardinal in 1946. So, I mean, that's just one small example, but there certainly was room for protest for Catholics.
Okay, so somebody asked, what was Hitler's true attitude towards Christianity?
Well, many books have been written about this, speculating. It seems that from what we know, Hitler was very pragmatic. And so it's what a lot of historians, and myself included, would say is that Hitler certainly knew he needed to work with the churches, and especially before the war, he was greatly concerned about his image and Germany's image abroad, and sort of the public relations aspect of this. And the churches were very important in lending legitimacy as sort of pillars of German society. And so, the way he chose to handle the churches in the 30s does not necessarily reflect his thought for down the road. We know Hitler imagined that the Third Reich would be the 1,000-year Reich. And so what was in his mind as to what would happen to the churches after the war is probably there would be no place for the churches. But in many regards, we still can only speculate, and again, just look at what he did say and do during the 30s and 40s.
Okay. Someone also asked, did German American Christians have views on Nazism apart from your example of the Seventh-Day Adventists?
Yes, so what was happening in Germany was followed very closely by Protestants, Catholics in the United States. So this church struggle that I described in the early 33, 34, 35, American Christians, yes, paid attention to this. We have a wonderful exhibit at the museum, which now you can view quite a bit of the material online on our website on Americans and the Holocaust. And so at the beginning of that exhibition, there's some very interesting materials about, on the one hand, there's a lot of anti-Semitism here in the United States as well. On the other hand, there's a lot of protest and a lot of efforts by various Christian denominations and relief organizations, humanitarian organizations to address the great humanitarian refugee crisis of the 1930s. And so, sort of from all these different angles, yes, Americans were very interested and informed.
Okay. So do any particular Christian clergy come to mind that did protest against the treatment of the Jews by the Nazis?
Sure. Well, of course, the von Galen is a great example of protesting the Nazi treatment of people with disabilities, not the Jews. There were individual priests and pastors who protested, but I think more interesting than public protests, which were not as common, are the actions of some clergy and lay people just to give assistance to Jews who are being persecuted, or solidarity. Now, I've also studied the Quakers. The Quakers are a very interesting Christian group in Germany, very, very small in number, and yet their networks did a lot to hide Jews, to give solidarity to Jews, not just hiding them in their apartments, or helping them with food or other material assistance, but also giving, showing ongoing friendship and solidarity and social outlets and things like that. So usually, yes, we can find these stories. They're usually of individual efforts or smaller networks, rather than coming from the top.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any idea, was there any relationship between Jewish clergy and Christian clergy in Germany during the Holocaust?
So, like, personal relationships between Christian clergy and Jewish clergy.
I think that's what the question was. Yeah, were there any relationships between Jewish religious leaders and Christian religious leaders before World War II, such as interfaith meetings to dispel misconceptions, misunderstandings, erroneous assumptions, etc.?
I think there were some of these cases. They were few and far between, I'm afraid, in Germany. This is more common, I think, in the United States and even in Britain in the pre-war years. Again, the Quakers come to mind, especially they had ongoing relationships with famous German Jewish philosopher, uh, thinkers, Martin Buber, friends of Rosenzweig, and they set up these ongoing things in the Protestant and Catholic churches. I am not aware of that kind of interfaith and dialogue or ongoing relationships happening before the war.
Yeah, may not have been really a concerted. I mean, there was some happening, but really after Vatican II was when things really started to open up, at least with the Catholic Church and the Jewish communities.
I mean, certainly on an individual level, there certainly were Jews and Christians who knew each other. There was a lot of intermarriage, or people had relatives, or but more formalized, within the church, like set up dialogues. Yeah, I'm not so sure about that.
Okay, thank you. Someone else asked, in the wake of rising anti-Semitic incidents, I'm assuming today, especially in Wisconsin and other places, that there's been an effort by the Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee with the Milwaukee Archdiocese to start to educate high school and middle school students about the Holocaust. Do you have any information from what you do or your colleagues if there's being a more concerted effort by the Catholic entities to teach about the Holocaust in grades K through 12?
Well, I know that in the public education system, a lot of states have actually passed legislation that mandates Holocaust education. So that's on the public school side, and of course the museum where I work also works with a lot of K-12 educators, and there's a huge conference for teachers every summer. So that it's an interesting question. I'll have to ask my colleague. The teachers, any teachers that they get from Catholic schools, as opposed to just the public school system. I'm sure there must be some, but I don't have numbers for that. In my office, we don't work with K-12 audiences as much. So I don't, in my work, we work with both academics, but also with religious leaders and different, certainly Catholic organizations, and but not so much K-12. So.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we're going to stop there. I'm going to say a few words in closing, and I particularly want to thank Dr. Rebecca Carter-Chang for joining us. I hope next time you'll actually be able to be physically present in Milwaukee. We would love to host you and to see you and have you visit us. For the Lux Center and Sacred Heart Seminary, it would be fascinating to be able to converse in person rather than just on Zoom. So someday we hope that happens, and we thank you so much for your time and your knowledge and your expertise. And we hope that all of you have been enjoying this session and being able to take advantage of it. And to let you know, this session has been recorded, and in a few days it will appear on the Lux Center web pages, which, as I said, is part of the Sacred Heart Seminary and School of Theology website at www.shsst.edu. The Lux Center has been pleased to present the Jewish Study Seminars for Christians this year. This is the last session of this series. We hope you will join us again when we tackle other interesting topics in our sessions next year, 2021, 2022. And just to let you know, a couple of programs are coming up in preparation for Lent. The Lux Center is hosting a webinar next week, Tuesday, February 16th, a conversation about the book Jesus Wasn't Killed by the Jews with the editor of the book, John M. Sweeney, and book contributors, Sister Mary Boyes, Robert Ellsberg, and Dr. Greg Garrett. And that's at 6:30 Central Time next Tuesday. And then on Sunday, March 31st is the Lux Center Spring Lecture, which we have every year. This year, our speaker is Rabbi Burton Vysotsky from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. His topic will be Blood Brothers, Jews and Christians as Sibling Rivals. We thank again Dr. Carter Chand, and we thank all of you for being with us this evening. We hope to see you again soon, and stay warm, stay well. Good night.